Welcome to Asia Pacific Defense Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. At the start of the last episode, I'm sure I left everyone hanging on the edge of their seats by saying that Donald Trump was about to make an announcement about a military aid package for Ukraine. Well, I have to report I think it's a little bit of a fizzer. And that's for two principal reasons. That he gave Putin a 50-day period to start negotiations with Ukraine, or he would impose potentially crippling secondary sanctions on countries purchasing Russian oil, principally China and India, putting on, tariffs of 100%. And these would have the effect, if they were ever implemented, of really reducing Russia's revenue stream coming from oil, and that would be a significant blow. However, 50 days from when it was announced takes us to early September, which gives Russia all of that time to unleash hell on Ukraine and seize as much territory as possible. Now, I did a little bit of digging into the date of early September, when theoretically these additional measures cut in. Now, that also usually marks the start of the autumn rainy season. As students of military history know, there are two periods when campaigning in Russia, ground campaigns, grind to a halt: the spring rains and the autumn rains. The countryside gets bogged, everything turns to mud. It's a nightmare in terms of transport, logistics, maneuver operations that lasts about a month. Could this be coincidence? The cynic in me says not. Putin knows come early September, things are naturally going to grind to a halt, so I suspect, whether he said it directly or indirectly, he has said to Trump, give me up until then, and I'll do what I can. Now, that's if these sanctions ever do come into effect. My own suspicion is that if President Putin were to phone President Trump with a few days to go and say, we have nominated you for the Nobel Peace Prize and we've purchased $5 billion worth of Trump meme coins, the sanctions might be pushed back, another 100 days or 100 years or whatever. On the military aid, look, anything is welcome. The key component to this is more Patriot missiles, and I'll come back to that a bit later in this podcast. But again, this is not a gift of US hardware to Ukraine. It's a sale of US systems to European NATO countries who in turn will donate their own Patriots or maybe transfer the new ones to Ukraine. So it's not a particularly generous arrangement. It's also unclear what the time frame is for that. So I'm pleased that something is happening, but the cynic in me says that the end result could be pretty disappointing. Now, I notice as well that some of the donated Australian M1A1 main battle tanks have started to arrive. Good, I welcome that. It should have happened a long time ago. I've also said in a previous podcast that given the changed circumstances on the battlefront, the effective end of maneuver warfare until someone can figure out how to defeat mass swarms of small drones, those M1A1s are sort of a theoretical addition to Ukrainians' fighting power, because I'm pretty sure that they're going to be stored in a shed somewhere. Still, it's better there than nothing, but there we go. Now, also in the last podcast, well, in fact, in the last edition of Asia Pacific Defense Reporter, I previewed that some changes are coming up in defense, some sort of shake-up. Now, a few days later, I was able to update that online, thanks to some additional digging that I was able to do. And yes, it sounds like defense has been instructed to cut back on their senior ranks, and the number that I've been given is that 30% of people of 1 star and above will be given their marching orders. I don't have a lot more detail than that. I don't know about the time frame. if this comes about, 30% of anything, that's a significant percentage, and will make a difference to the department and to the senior civilian workforce as well. But once again, as I somewhat cynically pointed out in my written analysis of all of this, just cutting back on senior numbers doesn't make an organization more efficient. In fact, in the short term, as people go and things have to be rejigged, it can slow things down rather than speeding them up. What I would also very much like to see is a restructuring of the department itself, because just fiddling with numbers makes very, very little difference. You've got to look at the way that the capability formulation process works. You've got to look at capability delivery, and I've touched on those previously. I'm not going to recap on all of those in this podcast because there's a bit of territory to cover. In the last few days, both Defence Minister Richard Marles and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, the later during his visit to China, Richard Marles during exercise Talisman Sabre, have sort of stuck to the line about the defence budget. It's not about the money, it's about the capability being delivered to the ADF. Indeed it is. I'm in 100% agreement with that. But that's exactly the point. What new capabilities are we actually getting? As we keep repeating, it's not just me or journalists, it's all sorts of analysts, it's all sorts of people, active or retired, who are pointing out the same thing over and over again, but the government is simply not receptive. And over the next 10 years, when you look at the integrated investment plan and combine that with the consequences of the Defence Strategic Review, over the next decade there is nothing new for either the Army or the Air Force, or from what little we know about what's going on in cyber and space, it also seems there's nothing new. It's stuff that's been in the pipeline for several years. Yes, the backbone of the Air Force, 72 F-35s, at least one assumes they will all receive what's called the Block 4 upgrade. I've touched on that in the past. That's a good thing. But from a budgetary point of view, it's inconsequential, thankfully. Army, the only things that I say that are in the pipeline are questionable, particularly additional M1A2 main battle tanks to replace the ones transferred to Ukraine. Battlefield dinosaurs, in my opinion. I also still have my doubts about the viability of Apache attack helicopters. And when you put that together with cuts to infantry fighting vehicles and self-propelled howitzer numbers, to me, to anyone else, I think, who just looks at the hardware part of the equation, that's a reduction in capability. And as I've done my best to elaborate previously, that's even more so for Navy. The Navy surface fleet is in poor shape. The number of hulls in the water is declining. Submarine availability is questionable. And so I just don't understand how the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister can get away with stating over and over again, it's all about capability and our allies understand the investments that we're making. Anybody who takes more than a cursory glimpse at the situation will see that the ADF is actually declining in combat power, not increasing in combat power. Now, I'll move on. I'll expand a little on my idea last week that Australia might want to have a look at the Korean medium-range ground-to-air missile system as a way of introducing some new capability to the ADF. And I'll be upfront by saying I haven't actually spoken with anyone from Korea about this, so these are entirely my own thoughts. As all of us can see, there's currently a shortage of effective ground-to-air missile systems capable of defending against medium-range threats, which are typically in the 30-kilometre to 200-kilometre zone. There's a bit of flexibility in the definitions, but let's stick with that. Now, it's at these distances that aircraft are typically launching glide bombs and their own shorter-range missiles. It's also typically the distance when ground-based radars, especially with a raised antenna or a radar unit on top of a hill, those ranges when they are starting to detect a variety of incoming threats, especially aircraft and things like theatre ballistic missiles, such as Scuds. Now, when it comes to defensive missile ranges, it's healthy to have quite a bit of overlap in your systems, rather than one ends here and the other takes over 1 metre on. And true, Australia is now fielding an effective short-range system in the form of something called NASAMS that uses ground-launched air-to-air missiles. In fact, one of them is on the front cover of the current APDR, so if you want to have a look at NASAMS doing a test firing of an AIM-9X missile, it's there in all its glory. Now, exemplars of medium-range defensive missiles are the PAC-3 Patriots, which have been around for a while. They were deployed during Gulf War I and were marginally so effective against Scud missiles being launched from Iraq, and they've been greatly improved, adding a hit-to-kill approach. I can elaborate on that if anyone's interested. Now, the facts are the US cannot build them fast enough. They're in great demand, not only from Ukraine, but other allies. I'm not entirely sure where the European equivalent, the Aster missile family, is going. I mean, it's a high-performance system, but there are production limitations, and early deployments to Ukraine have revealed some shortfalls, which are being corrected, but these things take time. Israel has their own solution. They have a multi-tiered approach to missile defense, and in the medium-range category is a thing called David Sling, but given the threats to that country, they will probably want to store as many of them as they can. By the way, for all of my Israeli friends, I don't believe the main threat to your country is coming from desperate, starving Palestinians lining up for food or sheltering in Catholic churches. So when you look at the big picture for this vital capability of medium-range defensive missiles, once you eliminate as sources of supply the US, Europe, and Israel, and have a look around at what's left, well, a potential partner, as I touched on, in our region that has developed their own is South Korea, the Republic of Korea, with something called the KM-SAM, Block 2. It's an interesting system because it's based partly on Russian technology, though there's no Russian hardware in it, but I'll explain. In the 1990s, when South Korea was looking at building up very much its own indigenous defense industry, it again sort of looked globally at who was doing what, and they looked to Europe for some solutions, the United States for others. But there are a couple of niche technologies where they actually engaged Russian companies and in some cases bought some Russian hardware just so that they could fully understand what's going on. Anyway, so they've come up with their own system. It, by definition, has to be highly capable because it's designed to defeat huge numbers of threats being fired from North Korea. And that could happen at any moment. There's no warning time. The North could attack tomorrow. So the South Koreans have to be ready to go. And it's also why they can build things to scale. Now, I'm aware that a senior South Korean delegation from their procurement agency will be in Canberra in mid-August, and I'll be watching with very, very great interest to see if anyone from the Australian Department of Defence is going to participate in any of that and try and get away from their AUKUS-only mindset. And highly relevant to that, and again I touched on this in my online analysis about cuts to senior defence leadership, there was an article in the Australian Financial Review that I quoted from Peter Varghese, former Secretary of DFAT, and somebody who's intimately familiar with our Department of Defence. He's been involved in a number of views, and his point was forget AUKUS Pillar 1 and the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines because it's unaffordable and it's warping the mindset of Australian military planners, and I couldn't agree more. And for me, this is a challenge just as important, possibly more so, than funding additional projects and reinstating some of those that have been cancelled. It's changing the way that defence views the world and, in turn, how they influence ministers with this rather backward-looking view of the situation. And if you have been doing exactly the same thing over and over again for the last 30 years, such as turning to the US foreign military sales catalogue every time you are thinking about buying something, it is, of course, difficult to suddenly start thinking differently. The same thing can be said about the sanctity of the US alliance, which has been the reality since the Second World War, but is now no longer appropriate. And we also need to eradicate or at least reduce groupthink in defence, such as the current prevailing view that AUKUS will fix all of our security problems. Now, I noticed that the current CDF, Admiral David Johnson, I don't know him well. To be honest, I'm not sure whether we've met, but people speak very highly of him. And I saw that he was interviewed during exercise Talisman Sabre, and he expressed some reservations about the Australian procurement system, said we had to make sure that it was delivering the things that we wanted in a timely manner. I noticed that Richard Marles echoed the same thing, as if he's just come into the portfolio rather than having been there for now 3.5 years. But anyway, let's not get too snarky about that. David Johnson, I'm sure a very nice man. He also repeated the line that the vast majority of procurements are on time and on budget. Now, when people in the defence system and ministers reflexively repeat that line as well, vast majority on time and on budget, it always makes me grind my teeth, because this is a typical piece of deception from defence, a deliberate misuse of statistics. Because when you look at all of the contracts that defence awards each year, the vast majority are tiny little administrative things. If somebody is driving a military vehicle and a commercial vehicle, to go down the shops to buy some more coffee and tea, and stops at the garage and fills the car up using their credit card, that counts as a procurement. I mean, why would it not? You're using government funds to buy a thing, in the case of petrol, a product. But when you add all of those things in, buying some photocopy, copy of paper, same deal, when you aggregate all of that, of course it's easy to say that the vast majority of procurements are on time and on budget. What any sensible person would do, you would break out those simple purchases, which are probably, look, I don't know, someone else has done the numbers, I think at some point, that's probably 80% of what defence is doing. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're putting in petrol in the car, exactly as it should be, and you're paying exactly what you need to. What really counts are the big strategically important projects, such as the Hunter-class frigate project, that sort of thing. And when they run late and when they are over budget, they're the ones that have the big impact. So let's get realistic about these things. Let's not be distracted by a level of departmental BS that it's all on time and on budget. The capabilities of the ADF are shrinking, not increasing. That's something that all Australians need to be aware of. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.